Previously, on part 1 of the KOFA Special. We began our trip after camping out south of Castle Dome Road. We headed along a 15-mile trail deep into the remote southern stretches of the Castle Dome Mountains, over the rugged and sometimes slow-going terrain. After making it to the end of the road, we explored the ruins and the history of the Big Eye Mine, an interesting gold producer that has structures and tunnels set amidst the rocky terrain. From the Big Eye, we backtracked to the nearest main dirt road and visited the Castle Dome Mine Museum, a collection of historic buildings and artifacts that tell the story of this rich silver mining district. It was getting late in the day, so we headed north via a bypass deeper into the Castle Dome Mountains in search of camp. We found an incredible spot that overlooked the landscape and enjoyed a lovely sunset, some great food, and tasty beverages before hitting the hay. Today, we continue with day 2 of the trip, continuing north through the remainder of the Castle Dome Mountains into the King Valley. We'll push deep into this vast open area, along mostly fast-moving dirt roads into the heart of KOFA, where we'll explore 2 more historic stops at the base of the KOFA Mountains. The Northstar mine, a pristine mining camp that few people get to see with a wide range of ruins left behind today, and the King of Arizona mine and cemetery, the namesake for this entire region and one of the richest producers in the area. Afterwards, we'll head into the western reaches of KOFA and for our next camp near Palm Canyon. Our day began early, just a few minutes before sunrise. We had a lot of ground to cover today and wanted to get a jump on the miles. After making it out of the tent, the vibrant sky was full of color to our east. The rugged backdrop of Castle Dome Peak and the surrounding mountains cut into the sky. We scanned the terrain, looking for bighorn sheep and anything else that might be moving around. The desert was quiet, still, and cool. The first light of the day hadn't yet made it to the valley to our west, and the layers upon layers of mountains behind it.
Alright, good morning from day 2. This is the view we woke up to. Not too bad. Had a good night. Slept pretty well. This was a much quieter camp. There was no coyotes or anything that we really heard or cared about. No other wildlife. Very mild weather. No wind. Megan is back there making breakfast, and I'm just kind of out here checking out the view before the sun really comes up. It's just before 7 now, and we'll be trying to get an early start on the trail today, make up a few miles from yesterday, and make sure we can hit most of the things that we have planned for today. So I'm gonna shut up and just enjoy this view for a little bit more, and then we will head back to camp and see what's going on back there. But what a phenomenal campsite. Just everywhere you look, across this valley, back towards the Castle Dome Mountains, it's all just beautiful.
As the shadow of night slowly crept away, I headed back to camp, where Megan was working on getting a quick breakfast started. This morning we would be enjoying some fresh-made cinnamon rolls, which only required a quick heat up on the stove. We sat down to enjoy as the sun continued to rise. The warm food was great on a slightly chilly morning like today. Across the valley, the first light of the day finally made it to the mountain peaks. After a quick round of dishes, it was time to get rolling. We packed up camp under the watchful eye of the goldfish, which was still flying high overhead. It didn't take long to get everything cleaned and reset, and we fired up the Jeep to begin another day of exploration. We turned right to head north and resumed the trek through the Castle Dome Mountains we started yesterday. From our campsite, the trail descended along the edge of the valley as it skirted around the mountains. There were a few damp spots on the trail as we continued through the incredibly green and lush vegetation. Underneath a clear blue sky, it was the perfect time to be exploring the desert. The road remained pretty narrow as we continued along. In most places, it was only wide enough for one vehicle, which wasn't a problem because we hadn't seen another person since yesterday afternoon. The surface ranged from hard-packed dirt to rockier, washed-out sections. The trail crosses several small washes, some of which were smooth and others that were more eroded out. We began to climb as we turned back towards the mountains. The early start to the day was nice. When planning this trip, I had banked on us doing all of this trail yesterday and camping much further down the road, but because of the pace of the day and our stops, we had to cut the mileage short. So, to make good ground this morning helped us quickly make up the miles. The trail had several tight turns and got rougher overall as we pushed deeper into the Castle Domes. We weaved in and out of the shadows of the mountain as we continued further north. Some tight sections may give you a little Arizona pinstriping, which is a great reminder that this route wouldn't be great for overly large or long vehicles to traverse. As we cut our way through the Castle Domes, the trail continued to climb, and our pace was slowed over some tougher areas. Eventually, we made it to a high point, the 1,957-foot McPherson Pass, marking the uppermost reaches of the trail. On the other side, the trail descended as it twisted and turned. At this point, we began to pass a few people camped out along the trail, but we still had not seen any other traffic moving yet. Much more of this section was spent in the washes as we weaved our way northeast. These areas were generally fast-moving as the Jeep cut through the sandy areas. Six miles from camp, the mountains began to give way to a large open area in front of us. This was the King Valley, a clearing that bisects the middle of the KOFA National Wildlife Refuge and separates the southern Castle Dome Mountains and the more central northern KOFA Mountains we could see across the way. We made an important turn at one of the many marked number signposts spread throughout KOFA and headed due north in a large wash. The volcanic flats on the eastern side of the range were easygoing for the most part. The terrain was dominated by cholla and other shrubs and bushes. We enjoyed some nice views of the jagged KOFA Mountains in the distance, which is where we were aiming for our next stop. A few slow-and-go sections disrupted our pace, but we made good time otherwise. The area to the left of the road was still designated wilderness as part of the KOFA Wilderness, while the right side of the road was National Wildlife Refuge land. Regardless, it was all areas which are no drone zones, so I had to resort to getting some other creative shots as we went along. 12.5 miles from camp, we made it to a major dirt road, one of only a few that penetrate KOFA. Because of this, we saw significantly more people camped along the road in this area. There was another marked number post, and we turned right on King Valley Road to continue our push deeper into the region. Unlike the rest of the day so far, King Valley Road was wide and fast-moving. According to the map, it is maintained for any high-clearance vehicle, but we found it to be pretty suitable for nearly any vehicle on most sections. Roads like this, with its gravel surface, high traffic, and generally high-speed traffic, are susceptible to washboards. For the most part, it was a smooth ride, thanks in part to the fact it looked like the road had been graded recently. A myriad of wash crossings were the only change, as the road generally headed in a long, straight line to the east. The scenery was pretty unchanging, as a large number of desert brush dominated this flat, open area. Castle Dome Peak and the mountains we had spent the trip in so far slowly faded away behind us. It felt incredibly remote, even though we were on what is considered a major road around here. After 8 miles, we turned left at another major junction to head north. While the road does continue straight here, it gets rougher and eventually dead ends as it heads back towards the Castle Dome Mountains. The wide dirt road continued as we headed northbound. A portion of the area right of the road is the only part of the KOFA range closed for Sonoran pronghorn protection. There were a surprisingly decent number of puddles remaining on this stretch, and the road narrowed in some areas, and also had some deep gravel to navigate. My passenger, who had taken over second shooter duties, got a kick out of the idea of a camera on a really long stick. Ironically, the deeper into the wilderness we headed, the more people we saw. There were several small traffic jams on the road. We continued to aim northward for the KOFA Mountains, which were now dead ahead and growing closer with each mile. After a trail split, the road quality began to deteriorate. The rocky surface bumped and jostled us around and required a much slower speed. The mountain up ahead was fascinating to look at while we drove up. The rugged and craggy terrain was so unique and distorted. And to only add more intrigue, the large foundations of a mining operation came into view partway up the mountain. After passing an interesting road sign, which on first look appeared as though it was telling us to speed up to 65 miles an hour, we stayed straight. As we got closer, it became clear that this was a pretty sizable operation. The road came to a locked gate at the base of the mountain, and we pulled off to park. This was the Northstar mine, and the former mining camp called Polaris. From the parking area, we could see a large cabin still standing, and amidst the vast tailings, several foundations, mine entrances, and other equipment and wood piles remaining. From here, it would be on foot uphill to explore the ruins. The first order of business was to investigate the wood cabin. With its white paint and metal roof, it looked appealing set against the backdrop of the mountain. A small sign out front gives a brief history of the area and also calls the mine Antares, a name that really doesn't pop up anywhere in the research I've found. This cabin and other structures would have existed to house workers and their families, serve as headquarters buildings, and serve other functions around town. Unfortunately, the door was padlocked shut, but around the side, a broken window offered a glimpse inside, which was set with mostly period furniture and other remnants of the past. The cabin at one point was open to visitors to stay in. Several spring bed frames and bunks are found throughout. The building has seen better days, and some people have vandalized it, but it remains in fairly good shape. The remote location and lack of many visitors helps keep it preserved. We sat on the porch for a moment and imagined what life would have been like here over 100 years ago. We continued uphill as the road dilapidated further towards the main ruins of the operation. The Northstar mine began with one man named Felix Mayhew. In the 1890s, Mayhew was employed at the King of Arizona mine, just 2 miles to the south of here, working on the night shift. In his free time during the day, Mayhew would go out prospecting in the area. On one fortuitous day, he came across a rock ledge here that looked promising. He consulted a coworker at the King of Arizona mine, simply known by his nickname, the Expert, who said the vein looked worthless. Mayhew, however, disagreed and staked a claim on it. In 1907, he sold his prospect, now called the Northstar Mine, to the Golden Star Mining Company for $350,000. By 1908, a 50-ton cyanide mill was constructed on site to process the ore. The mill capacity was later doubled to 100 tons to keep up with the demand of the operation. A company town was constructed by the owners to support mine operations. Because the mine was called Northstar, the town was called Polaris, after the celestial reference. Canvas tents and other wood-framed business structures were constructed to house and serve workers. At its peak, about 150 residences were on site, and up to 2,000 people lived in the area. Water was pumped uphill 3 miles via a pipeline from the King of Arizona mine for operations. After only 3 years, the mine and mill were shut down in August of 1911 due to the fall-off of high-grade ore. Immediately after closing, a watchman was kept on the property and equipment was left where it was in hopes the mine would be revitalized in subsequent years. According to mine documents, it wouldn't be until 1936 when that happened. And this would be the problem that plagued the Northstar. Numerous mine evaluations, studies, and exploratory work, occurring in 1936, 1948, 1951, throughout the 1960s, all came to similar conclusions. While there was always the possibility of additional rich gold veins beyond what work was already done, the Northstar had been worked pretty extensively, depleting most of the riches that were buried far below the mountain. What nearly every report found was the true value of the mine was to be found in the tailings. Because of the methods used on initial milling, a surprising amount of gold was essentially thrown away in the waste piles. Assays of the tailings from the Northstar found that about 0.1 ounces of gold could be recovered per ton. While this was nowhere close to the 1.4 ounces per ton the mine was averaging during its peak years, when you're talking about 30,000 tons of waste, that can really add up very quickly. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, surveying and assaying was done more seriously. By 1983, the mine tailings were finally being reworked after the property exchanged hands a handful of times. Up to 180 tons a day were reprocessed. 2 on-site generators were brought in, and water was hauled 68 miles from Welton and stored in a 155,000-gallon pond. Workers lived in 2 mobile homes on site. Despite the effort, apparently only 65 ounces of gold was recovered. A company named Caprock Energy purchased the property and shipped some ore to the Hayden smelter. The mine transferred ownership one last time to the Yuma Gold Mines Ltd., who dewatered the mine and conducted a number of drilling operations in an attempt to reevaluate the property. As it turns out, the Northstar would never be as profitable as it was between 1908 and 1911. Despite only operating for 3 years, roughly 25,000 to 35,000 tons of ore was milled at the Northstar, producing 1.1 million of period values worth of gold and silver. That would be $34 million today. In total, over 20,000 ounces of silver and 47,000 ounces of gold was shipped from the mine in its lifetime. The Northstar had 2 main inclined shafts, one that went only 90 feet and another that went 500 feet deep. With levels every 100 feet, about 3,500 feet of underground workings are reported today. And with the large number of mine surveys, plenty of modern maps, and even 3D views of the inner workings are available today. As we walked around the ruins, there was evidence of the massive amount of work that was done here at the Northstar. What is surprising is just how little remains of the town of Polaris. Aside from the cabin, there really isn't much. Perhaps the best preserved ruins of the Northstar are around the mine entrances and inside of the workings themselves. The door of the main haulage tunnel was locked at one point, but there were no signs. Inside, electrical panels and switches look as if you could flip them on today and the mine would come back to life. Ladders, still precariously perched, are in great shape. Around the entrances and adits, wood timbering, ladders, and even an old elevator cage, which would have hauled men and equipment up and down, are present. Everywhere we looked, there was something new to see, offering a better understanding of the operation and what happened here. The view from the upper levels was impressive. Looking out, you could see the outline of the more modern tailing pond, as well as portions of the pipeline that would have carried water 3 miles to the operation. To the south was KOFA Butte and the still occupied buildings surrounding the King of Arizona mine, which was just on the backside of the small hills. After sufficiently exploring the Northstar, we began back downhill, picking our way through the ruins and rock piles. On the way back, we found a small mine portal. I couldn't believe what was inside. Boxes and boxes of core samples left on the ground and rotting away from the weather. These were from one of the many surveys of the Northstar, which attempted to breathe life back into the operation. They were simply left on site. We had spent a significant chunk of time exploring the Northstar. It was close to noon by the time we made it back to the Jeep. Although the weather was still mild, hiking through the desert in the late morning sun was still a little warm. Once at the Jeep, we retraced the short distance along the rough spur that led us to Polaris. We eventually turned left once back to the main road to keep moving a little further east to our next series of stops. It didn't take long to make our way around the small mountain surrounding the King of Arizona mine. To our left, KOFA Butte sharply rose up out of the desert floor. We arrived at another junction and parked the Jeep, figuring this was as good a place as any to stop for lunch. Lunch today required a little assembly. Megan worked to combine a series of ingredients that I retrieved from the cooler and food box. I was able to use my rock hammer to prep one of the ingredients. Methodically, she stirred the chicken, pecans, grapes, and other ingredients together. The mixture was served open-face in an avocado. I had never seen a lunch quite like this, and as far as camping food, this felt bougie as heck. It did not disappoint, however. It was satisfying, hearty, and refreshing all at the same time. Loaded with all kinds of good stuff, we enjoyed the food as we sat in the middle of nowhere. After eating, we began walking around the area, looking to see what ruins we could find. The legendary King of Arizona mine began in a way not unlike many other big mines. Charles Eichelberger was prospecting in the southern KOFA Mountains in 1896. At the time, this was a truly remote and desolate region. After nearly running out of water, he began to head up a canyon in search of a natural water tank. He found an alcove of rainwater tucked on a rock ledge. As he overlooked the surrounding area, sipping his hard-earned water, he scanned the terrain. As if by divine providence, a shiny reflection nearby caught his attention. Sure enough, this would be the spot where the massive gold outcropping that birthed the King of Arizona mine was located. Charlie joined forces with H.B. Gleason and Eaps Randolph, who together organized the King of Arizona Mining Company. Originally called Gleason, the mine was eventually renamed King of Arizona. Within a year, by June of 1897, a 5-stamp amalgamation mill was built near Mohawk, located on the Gila River 35 miles to the south. During this first summer, work at the King of Arizona mine picked up, but the location meant the mine wasn't busy enough to warrant the development of a town, yet. Miners slept out in the open, which proved difficult for those working the night shift and trying to sleep in the hot desert sun. The lack of a reliable water supply was also troublesome. Water was hauled by mule teams on a 2-day trip from the wells at Mohawk. The water was hauled in old wine and whiskey barrels, and by the time it reached camp, was often foul-tasting. Many miners got sick because of it, but there was no other choice at this point. Eventually, as the mine was further developed, capital began to pour in to upgrade the amenities. A boarding house, bunkhouse, store, saloons, and a school were constructed as the company built a town. The ongoing attempt to make reliable water continued. Several attempts to drill deep wells on site proved pointless. Eventually, one deep well, drilled to about 1,000 feet, was created about 5 miles to the south of the mine, in the plains of the King Valley. With water finally secured, a 100-ton mill and cyanide plant was built at the mine. With time, the mill was eventually further built to a 250-ton capacity. The mine reliably churned out high-grade gold and some silver. After refining on site, gold bars were stamped with K of A, shorthand for King of Arizona, and hence the KOFA name was born. 125 men were employed at the mine. Majority of the workers were Cornish, Mexican, or Chinese. The Cornish mainly worked in the mines, the Mexicans hauled wood and other equipment, and the Chinese worked as company cooks. On June 5, 1900, the KOFA post office was open. The company town was described by some as a, quote, model community. 300 people lived here and looked after each other, keeping crime to a minimum. Surprisingly, baseball was among the favorite pastimes of miners living and working at KOFA. The workings churned out high-grade ore for a while. During its peak, production averaged 200 tons per day. This ore was valued at around $40 per ton. It wasn't until 1910, when the shaft had reached the 750-foot level, when the ore quality dropped to just $3 per ton. At this point, the mine shut down, but had produced over 700,000 tons of ore worth $3.5 million in gold alone during its lifetime. That $3.5 million would be worth $111 million today. KOFA was worked intermittently through 1937, but never to the success of its early life. Later in life, much like the Northstar, the KOFA mine changed ownership. Barron's Gold Company built a leaching facility and began to reprocess old tailings in 1986 with limited success. Much of the equipment left behind today is remnants of that period of mining. Today, KOFA remains on private property. The boundaries are well signed and fenced, and it is clear you are not meant to enter the property. The backside of the mountain features large piles of tailings and some evidence of digging and working. Leaching equipment remains from the 1980s and can be viewed from a small hill just outside the private property line. Other evidence can be seen with a more careful eye. The front side of the mountain has several more modern buildings and looks to be occupied when we drove by. It is a shame that more doesn't remain from this highly profitable mine that played such an important role in Arizona history. A short distance east of where the mine was, we walked through the desert looking for something that was open to the public. Some ways off the road, we found the KOFA Cemetery. It has certainly seen better days, but featured several graves from those that lived and worked this area during KOFA's heyday. Most graves are unmarked or in such poor shape that there is no telling who is buried there. We did find one grave with markings, a young man named Reyes Garcia. And thanks to the incredible power of the internet, a newspaper article shows that he died in 1901 from typhoid pneumonia. He was a miner, as were likely many of these other people buried here, and a testament to life in a boomtown. After exploring the area the best we could, we returned to the Jeep to continue along our route. It was at this point, as we retraced the trails back around the KOFA mine, that we were in the most remote stretches of the KOFA range. It was a beautiful stretch of desert, one scattered with faint traces of human footprints. The road got progressively faster moving as we turned south and headed back for King Road. Along the way, we found ourselves briefly sidetracked at a pin marked KOFA Deep Well on some maps. Other than some very white minerals on the ground, there was nothing to see here, but this likely marked the spot of a former windmill or possibly the water source for mining operations back in the day, and the abundant green vegetation around further supported that. Back on King Road, our speeds improved as we blazed our way through the open desert in the vast expanse of the King Valley that we found ourselves in. Our plan from here was to continue further north, into the northern half of the KOFA range, but due to the lack of any road access, we were forced to stick to this road, which would eventually take us towards Palm Canyon. As we approached the western boundary of the National Wildlife Refuge, the road got busier, and the number of people camped out in RVs and trailers dramatically increased as we approached one of the main access points. Within just a little longer, we were arriving at Highway 95. We would be repositioning ourselves just 9 miles north, further along the highway, so we jumped on the road, not bothering to air up for this short stretch. After a very brief cruise northbound, we turned off once more into the next phase of our route. The road tracked due east and remained wide and well-traveled. Up ahead, Signal Peak and the sharp faces of Palm and KOFA Queen Canyon rose up. It was a phenomenal view, and another stunning side of KOFA. As expected, the area was busy as we crossed back into the National Wildlife Refuge. It was about 4 o'clock at this point, but we were right on track for the day. We split off the main road and followed a rougher track as it headed northeast. There were far less people as the road was narrower and required high clearance in places. This path continues all the way to KOFA Queen Canyon before dead-ending. We wouldn't need to follow it for long before finding a great spot. The spot we parked at was actually on BLM land, just outside of the KOFA boundaries, but the views were equally impressive. Behind us, the full horizon was occupied by jagged buttes and rough terrain. There was no one anywhere nearby, and once again, we found a little slice of peace and quiet. Megan worked to get the living room set up, and then I got to work on sleeping arrangements. While we still had some time before the sunset, it was nice to have a little extra downtime around camp to relax and hang out. Today we had spent a decent amount of time in the sun and were feeling a little drained. We sat in the shade, soaking in the view, and listened to the sounds of the desert. Somehow, the desert just doesn't get old. No matter how many times you see it, there is always something so fascinating and captivating by it. From high up, it seems so simple and barren, a wasteland of sand, rocks, and mountains. But zoomed in, its complexity and diversity come to light. It is incredible how anything, let alone the vast number of plants, animals, and people calling the desert home, are able to not only live, but thrive. Its rugged and formidable landscape is breathtaking and beautiful. As the time rolled by, eventually the sun sank lower in the sky. Some clouds near the horizon cast shadows on the ground, and the landscape surrounding us slipped in and out of sunlight. As the light changed, the depth of the mountains east of us became so much more complex. The former purple masses of mountain were now layers of rock units interspersed with cacti and dirt. Before the sunset, it was now past 5 o'clock somewhere, so it was time to dive back into the cooler for another beverage.
The first one is a brewery we have already seen. It is the Ranch Hand Brewing. This one's for you. It's an IPA. This is the one brewed in Eloy, Arizona. Ranch Hand, and just kind of thinking like we're out in the wilderness and cowboys in Arizona. Yeah. And the other one we got is from Simple Machine, which we love. Is a Mexican-style amber called Loteria, which is Mexican bingo, essentially. And I figure we are close to the border of Mexico, being near Yuma, therefore Loteria is relevant. And really beautiful can art. Cheers.
Cheers.
After a rather unfortunately unpleasant choice, swapping beers and cheersing again.
Cheers again.
We finally sat down to enjoy the last few minutes of the day, which only ramped up the beauty. The low sun cast its last light on the incredible Palm Canyon and KOFA Queen Canyon behind us. The terrain almost looked like it was on fire. In front of us, the rolling clouds cleared over the mountains far across the highway to our west. It was another magical moment. Dinner was being assembled, and the smells induced drool as we waited and cooked. Tonight would be Italian sausage, a mix of peppers and onions, and of course, some garlic bread made in a slightly unconventional way. The end product, however, was incredible. A satiating meal at the end of a full and fun day was perfect. With full bellies, it didn't take long before we were off to bed. Tune in next time as we conclude our journey across the KOFA National Wildlife Refuge. On day 3, we'll head into the scenic Palm Canyon on foot to further explore the hidden gems of the area. We'll continue tracking north and head to the last major trail on our route, a complete crossing of KOFA from west to east as we traversed between the New Water and KOFA mountains. Before getting to our exit point, we would stop at a famous rock collecting area and visit a historic cabin as we finished up the last few miles of KOFA. This stretch would be the most demanding yet and require a lot of effort to keep things running to the end, which we would hopefully make it to in one piece.